On a Thursday morning in November of 2021, the damp chill of upstate South Carolina had settled deep into the cracked concrete floor of the abandoned Oconee textile mill in Seneca. The air inside the cavernous loading bay smelled of stale rainwater, ancient machine oil, and the faint, ghostly sweetness of decades-old cotton dust. Elias Thorne stood near the back of the room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a frayed canvas Carhartt jacket that had long ago faded from brown to a washed-out sand. He was 52 years old, built with the broad, sloped shoulders of a man who had spent a lifetime leaning over workbenches. His face was weathered and quiet, framed by a short, salt-and-pepper beard, and his knuckles bore a webbing of pale silver scars, the permanent receipts of 30 years spent arguing with steel that didn't want to yield. Elias was staring at a mound of grease, rust, and heavy canvas tarp that the county auctioneer was trying very hard to ignore. It was the Oconee County tax forfeiture auction, and the space was packed, shoulder to shoulder. Men in insulated vests and steel-toed boots were hunting for bargains. Cheap utility trucks, usable scaffolding, or spools of copper wire that could be flipped for a quick profit by the weekend. Nobody in the room was looking at Lot 44. Lot 44 was listed on the auction manifest simply and dismissively as industrial equipment, scrap. Now, if you have never stepped foot inside a mid-century manufacturing plant, let me paint a picture of what Lot 44 actually was. It was a 1954 Carney and Trecker Model 3K horizontal milling machine. It wasn't merely a tool, it was an industrial monolith, standing 9 feet tall and taking up the floor space of a modern minivan. It was a staggering monument to an era when things were built to last forever. Designed to chew through hardened steel like it was warm butter, this machine had likely turned raw metal into parts for bridges, trains, and aerospace components. But today, it was covered in a crust of cosmoline and grime so thick you could carve your initials into it with a pocket knife. The auctioneer, a tired man named Hollis, who had been talking non-stop for 2 hours, and clearly just wanted to escape to an early lunch, eyed the iron behemoth with undisguised contempt. He keyed his microphone, the feedback whining sharply off the brick walls. All right, moving on to Lot 44. Look at your sheets, boys. Big old chunk of iron here. Let's start the bidding at $1,000. $1,000 for the whole lot. Nobody moved. The men in the crowd shuffled their boots. Someone coughed in the back. Hollis sighed, his breath pluming in the cold air. All right, 800. Who'll give me 800? Silence. The Carney and Trekker sat there, looking like a forgotten gravestone under the flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights. Look, the scrap weight on this alone is at least $400, boys, Hollis said, leaning heavily against his wooden podium. You drag it to the scrap yard, you make your money back today. Give me 400. Elias Thorne pulled his scarred right hand out of his pocket and raised his neon yellow bidder card. Number 72. Got 400, Hollis said, sounding genuinely surprised that anyone had taken the bait. Do I have 425? 425, anywhere in the room? Before Hollis could finish his chant, a sharp bark of laughter echoed across the room. It was Vance Gillerin. Vance was 10 years younger than Elias, wearing a spotless quarter-zip fleece, holding a sleek tablet. He owned Precision Tech, the largest and most profitable modern CNC machine shop in Oconee County. Vance ran a sterile, brightly lit haven of white-painted, computer-controlled machines that beeped, flashed, and cost upwards of $85,000 apiece. Vance didn't have grease under his fingernails. He had a business degree and an aggressive line of credit. Careful, Elias, Vance called out over the heads of the crowd. A smirk plastered across his face. "You'll have to pay someone $1,000 just to haul your new boat anchor to the dump." A few men in the crowd chuckled. They knew Elias, and they knew Vance. They represented two entirely different eras of the same trade, and it was no secret to anyone in Seneca which era was currently winning. Elias didn't look at Vance. He didn't shift his weight, didn't tighten his jaw, didn't offer a witty comeback to defend his pride. He just kept his pale blue eyes locked on the towering silhouette of the Kearney and Trekker, holding his bright yellow card steady in the freezing air. "Going once at 400, Hollis droned, ignoring the byplay. "Going twice." Elias finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried to the podium. 415. Hollis blinked. "Bid is 415 to the man in the back. Any advance on 415? He didn't even wait a full second. Smack. The wooden gavel fell against the podium with a sharp crack that rang off the high rafters. "Sold, lot 44, for $415 to bidder 72. Vance shook his head, turning back to his tablet, instantly dismissing the transaction as the folly of an old man who couldn't keep up with the times. But Elias Thorne just slipped the card back into his jacket. For the price of a decent pair of work boots, Elias had just purchased 9,450 pounds of supposedly obsolete, undeniably indestructible American cast iron. The heavy-duty wrecker groaned in low gear, its thick tires crunching loudly over the frost-heaved gravel of Elias Thorne's driveway. Elias stood just inside the open bay doors of his 40 by 60-foot corrugated metal pole barn, a steaming mug of black coffee in his scarred hands, watching his auction purchase arrive. He favored his left leg as he stood there, leaning his weight slightly against the steel frame of the doorway to take the pressure off his spine. If you want to understand how a man can look at a neglected, cosmoline-caked mountain of obsolete scrap iron and see absolute perfection, you have to understand the life that shaped his eyes. You have to know where he learned the true, unforgiving value of heavy things. Before he was the quiet, 52-year-old solitary fabricator running a modest welding and repair business behind his house, Elias had been a heavy diesel mechanic for the Norfolk Southern Railway. For 10 long, brutal years, he had lived in a world where everything was scaled for giants. He spent his days and nights rebuilding locomotive engines, massive V16 power plants that weighed more than a suburban starter home and produced enough torque to pull a mile of loaded freight cars over a mountain pass. He had learned the hardest lessons of his trade in the bitter, unheated rail yards of February, with the wind howling down the tracks and turning the industrial grease into stubborn glue. You didn't just unbolt things in that environment. Wrestling with locomotive parts required overhead gantry cranes just to lift a single piston assembly. It required specialized hydraulic wrenches, blowtorches, and heavy 12-pound sledgehammers to convince stubborn, frozen steel joints to finally yield. He had spent a decade fighting metal that fought back with terrifying force. That chapter of his life came to a violently abrupt end on a rainy Tuesday in 2019. A miscommunication during a routine coupling repair led to a sudden, catastrophic shift of a steel drawbar. The sheer weight of the dropped forged steel didn't kill him, but it crushed his L4 vertebra, sending him to the hospital for weeks and into grueling physical therapy for over a year. The injury effectively ended his career in the rail yard. The modest disability settlement paid for the pole barn and the welding equipment inside it, but the accident left him with a permanent, slight drag in his step, a chronic, biting ache when the barometric pressure dropped, and a reinforced, bone-deep respect for the laws of physics. Since the accident, Elias had spent the last 2 years working out of this barn, operating on his own terms. He didn't speak much. He didn't advertise. Word of mouth brought him local farmers with snapped tractor axles loggers with cracked skidder frames, and independent truckers with sheared suspension brackets. He fixed the broken things that were too heavy, too dirty, or too difficult for the sterile, modern machine shops in town to bother with. He was a man who possessed a fundamental, almost spiritual understanding of physical mass. In the modern world of machining, the world inhabited by men like Vance Gillerin, everything was about speed. Modern CNC machines used incredibly fast spindles and complex computer algorithms to slice through aluminum and mild steel, housing their delicate electronics in light, fabricated sheet metal enclosures. But Elias knew that when you need to cut hardened steel, when you need to take a massive bite out of a piece of raw iron, speed is irrelevant. When a steel cutter engages a block of solid metal, the metal screams. It violently resists the blade. That resistance creates chatter, and chatter creates vibration. In the world of machining, vibration is the absolute enemy of precision. It shatters expensive carbide tooling. It ruins the surface finish. It destroys accuracy down to the thousandth of an inch. Modern engineers tried to solve vibration with software, constantly compensating for the weakness of their lightweight, epoxy granite machine frames. Elias knew there was only one honest, structural way to defeat vibration. You don't outsmart it, you absorb it. You drown it in an ocean of dead weight. Mass is the only thing that truly absorbs vibration. As the wrecker driver hit the hydraulic levers and the flatbed began to tilt, the 1954 Kearney and Trecker milling machine slid slowly down the ramp, its massive steel base scraping heavily against the oak deck. It was over 9,000 pounds of dense, uncompromising cast iron. It wasn't just a tool to Elias. It was a 9,000-pound anvil designed to absorb the violence of cutting steel and render it completely silent. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the familiar, dull throb in his lower back, and watched the monster touch down on his concrete floor. He hadn't bought a boat anchor, he had bought a fortress. 5 miles across town from Elias's drafty pole barn sat the beating heart of Oconee County's modern manufacturing sector, Precision Tech. The building didn't look like a machine shop. With its tinted glass facade and manicured shrubbery, it looked more like a suburban medical clinic. Inside, the floors were coated in a flawless, high-gloss gray epoxy that perfectly reflected the banks of LED lights suspended from the ceiling. There was no dirt here, no smell of burning slag or ancient oxidized grease. The air was climate-controlled to a constant, comfortable 68 degrees and carried the faint, sweet scent of synthetic water-soluble coolant. Vance Gillerin walked down the center aisle of his shop floor on a Tuesday morning, swiping through production spreadsheets on his tablet. Flanking him on both sides were a dozen identical Haas VF2 vertical machining centers. They were beautiful in the way a modern sports car is beautiful, sleek, completely enclosed in pristine white sheet metal, and adorned with bright digital touchscreens that tracked their progress in fractions of a second. This was the established way of doing things. It was an ecosystem built entirely on the dual pillars of speed and software. Inside those white enclosures, 10,000 RPM spindles spun so fast they became a blur, vaporizing blocks of raw aluminum into gleaming components, while high-pressure jets of coolant blasted away the silver chips. When a machine needed to switch from a drill bit to a facing mill, an automatic carousel whipped around, seamlessly swapping the tooling in 3 seconds flat. The machines didn't require a mechanic to run them, they required a programmer. But there is a dark, uncompromising secret hidden behind all that speed and polished sheet metal. A modern Haas VF2 weighs roughly 7,300 pounds. To a layman, that sounds massive, but in the merciless physics of cutting metal, it is a featherweight. That weight comes from fabricated steel plates and hollow, light castings designed to be shipped cheaply and moved easily across concrete floors. It is an architecture engineered explicitly to chew through soft materials. aerospace aluminum, brass, Delrin plastics, and mild, agreeable steels. Vance had built a highly lucrative business model around these specific materials. Precision Tech survived and thrived on pure volume. Vance secured massive, recurring contracts for medical device components, surgical trays, optical brackets, and lightweight housings. He wanted materials that cut predictably and quickly. He didn't sell metalworking. He sold cycle times. If a part took 2 minutes to machine, Vance paid his programmers to tweak the code and get it down to 1 minute and 50 seconds. What Vance actively avoided, what he fundamentally despised, were heavy, hardened alloys. When you take a modern, lightweight CNC machine and try to force its spindle into a block of hardened tool steel or tough, heat-treated Inconel, the illusion of modern supremacy shatters. The frame of the machine, hollow and rigid rather than dense and dampening, begins to flex under the immense load. Microscopic vibrations cascade through the spindle down to the cutting tool. The machine doesn't hum, it shrieks. It sounds like a freight train locking its brakes on a rusted track. The tool chatters violently against the alloy until the brittle, expensive carbide inserts simply explode into a spray of shrapnel. Vance had learned early on that heavy cuts in angry metal broke his machines, ruined his expensive tooling, and, most importantly, destroyed his profit margins. He wanted no part of it. That was exactly why he had laughed at Elias in the auction house. In Vance's worldview, a 1954 Carney and Trekker wasn't just old. It was a prehistoric beast that belonged in a museum or a landfill. It had no computer interface. It couldn't change its own tools. It required a man to stand directly in the line of fire, turning heavy iron hand wheels by sheer physical force, dodging hot oil and flying chips. To a man who dealt in seconds, a machine that took an hour just to set up for a single cut was economically offensive. It was dangerous, excruciatingly slow, and completely irrelevant to a modern economy. Vance didn't look at Elias's purchase and see 9,000 pounds of vibration-absorbing cast iron. He saw a rusted monument to a dead century, bought by an old man too stubborn to realize he had already been left behind. The tow driver didn't want to hang around. He shoved an oily, handwritten invoice into Elias's hand. $850 for a 14-mile trip from the Seneca auction house, and climbed back into the cab of his Peterbilt before the dust had even settled. Elias didn't argue the price. You don't haggle with the only heavy wrecker in the Tri-County area willing to drag a 4.5-ton monolith onto a residential gravel driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. Getting the Carney and Trekker from the edge of the driveway into the center of the pole barn took Elias 3 grueling hours, 2 hydraulic tow jacks, a heavy-duty come-along winch, and 4 lengths of solid steel pipe. He moved it the way the Egyptians moved granite, jacking up the base, kicking a pipe underneath, winching the machine forward 3 feet, and then carrying the back pipe around to the front to repeat the process. By the time it finally settled onto the concrete slab in the center of the shop, he was soaked in cold sweat, his damaged lower back radiating a dull, fiery ache down his left leg. Sitting there in the dim light of the barn, stripped of the context of the crowded auction house, the milling machine looked less like a piece of industrial equipment and more like a shipwreck hauled up from the bottom of the Atlantic. It was a looming, jagged silhouette of rust, flaking paint, and unimaginable neglect. For the next 4 days, Elias ceased to be a mechanic and became an archaeologist. He bought 3 5-gallon buckets of mineral spirits from the hardware store and went to work. He didn't use power tools or wire wheels. They were too aggressive, too likely to score the critical metal underneath the grime. Instead, he used a simple brass putty knife. Brass is softer than cast iron. It will scrape away filth without scratching the steel it rests on. Hour after hour, day after day, Elias stood in the sharp chemical fumes of the mineral spirits, carving away 67 years of solidified grease stray cotton fibers, and dark cutting fluid that had baked into a substance resembling hardened asphalt. The barn smelled like a refinery. His hands turned completely black, the industrial grime working its way permanently into the ridges of his fingerprints and the webbing of his scars. It wasn't until the late afternoon of the fourth day, with the autumn sun casting long golden shadows through the barn's high, dusty windows, that he found what he was looking for. He was working on the massive front column of the machine, chiseling away a half-inch thick layer of black sludge, when the brass blade caught an edge and peeled off a long, thick strip of grime in one solid piece. Underneath the sludge, the metal wasn't pitted. It wasn't brown with oxidation. It was a gleaming, pristine silver. Elias paused. He grabbed the rag soaked in mineral spirits and vigorously scrubbed the exposed patch, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. These were the boxways. In the anatomy of a milling machine, the ways are the precision-ground steel tracks that allow the heavy knee and table of the machine to slide flawlessly up and down. If the ways are worn out, convex, or heavily scored from decades of abuse, the machine is useless for precision work. It cannot cut straight. Elias fetched a fresh microfiber cloth and meticulously cleaned the entire vertical length of the exposed track. He didn't just wipe it, he polished it until the cast iron reflected the overhead lights like a dark mirror. Then, he walked over to his red Kennedy toolbox and pulled out a velvet-lined wooden case. Inside was a Mitutoyo dial indicator attached to a heavy magnetic base. This wasn't a standard tape measure. It was a delicate, jewel movement instrument designed to measure physical variations in 100,000ths of an inch. He clamped the magnetic base onto the heavy iron knee of the machine and positioned the delicate, ruby-tipped stylus of the indicator against the freshly cleaned face of the vertical boxway. He carefully rotated the outer bezel of the gauge to set the dial face to absolute 0. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the massive cast-iron hand wheel that controlled the knee's elevation. With a smooth, steady pressure, he began to crank. The knee, an assembly weighing well over 1,000 pounds, began to rise along the column. Elias didn't watch the metal sliding past. He watched the white face of the Mitutoyo dial. As the knee traveled upward, 1 inch, 5 inches, 10 inches, the needle on the dial barely trembled. It held steady at 0, occasionally flickering a hair's breadth to the right before settling perfectly back into place. He cranked it through 18 full inches of vertical travel, the absolute maximum range of the machine's vertical axis. When he finally stopped, he leaned in close to read the final measurement. The needle rested at 0.0002, 2/10,000ths of an inch. To put that in perspective, a standard sheet of printer paper is roughly 3/1000ths of an inch thick. The wear on this massive machine, after a lifetime of supposedly cutting steel in a textile mill, was a fraction of the thickness of a single human hair. Elias let out a long, slow exhale, the tension completely draining out of his broad shoulders. The machine wasn't dead. It wasn't even tired. Vance Gillerin and the rest of the modern machining world had looked at the crust of cosmoline and grease and seen only rot. But Elias knew the truth now. That thick, repulsive layer of industrial sludge had acted as a perfect, hermetic time capsule. It had sealed the cast iron away from oxygen and moisture, protecting the machine's absolute geometric precision for 3 decades. He hadn't bought scrap metal. He had bought a masterpiece. The halogen bay lights of the pole barn buzzed with a low, constant electrical hum that Elias had long ago learned to tune out. At the deep plastic utility sink in the corner, he was working a heavy dollop of orange pumice soap into his hands, watching the black sludge of 60-year-old grease dissolve and swirl down the drain. The heavy side door of the barn groaned open, letting in a sharp gust of wind. Sarah Thorne stepped over the threshold, pulling a thick, knit sweater tight around her shoulders against the November draft. She had a silver laptop tucked securely under one arm. Sarah was 50, a high school calculus teacher with a mind that naturally organized the chaos of the world into neat, solvable equations. Since Elias's accident in the rail yard 2 years ago, the math of their lives had become incredibly tight. The disability settlement had paid for the construction of the barn, but it didn't pay the monthly mortgage or the grocery bills. Out of necessity, Sarah had become the financial bedrock of the household, tracking every incoming repair job and every outgoing expense. She didn't operate heavy machinery, and she didn't pretend to understand the complex metallurgy of cast iron, but she operated a spreadsheet with lethal, unyielding efficiency. She walked past the welding tables, cleared a pair of scratch safety glasses off his primary workbench, and set the laptop down. The screen woke up, casting a pale, clinical blue light across her face. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice cutting clearly through the hum of the overhead lights. "Let's run the actuals." Elias didn't turn around. He just kept scrubbing, digging his thumbnails into the deep creases of his palms. "You paid $415 at the auction," she said, her fingers dancing lightly over the trackpad. $850 for the wrecker to drag it here. Now, according to your notes, the machine requires 3-phase industrial power. Our residential grid only supplies single-phase. So, you need a 15-horsepower rotary phase converter just to trick the motor into spinning. "Found a used one," Elias murmured over the running water. "Guy up in Greenville is holding it for me." "I saw," Sarah replied, not missing a beat. $600, assuming it actually works. That puts your total capital investment at $1,865. She stopped scrolling and finally looked up, directing her gaze at his broad back. "Our agreed budget for shop expansion this quarter was $2,000, Elias. You have exactly $135 left. You can't even buy a decent modern cutting tool for that." Elias shut off the water with his wrist. He grabbed a blue paper shop towel, drying his hands as he walked slowly toward her. He favored his left leg slightly, the deep ache in his crushed L4 vertebra acting up from the days spent bent over a putty knife. "I don't need to buy modern tooling," he said. He moved past her to the tall red Kennedy toolbox against the wall and pulled open a heavy bottom drawer. The ball-bearing sliders groaned under the weight. The drawer was filled with massive, heavy cylinders of steel, armed with jagged, brazed carbide teeth. "Grandpa's old shell mills. They've been sitting in a cardboard box under a tarp since 1998. They fit the number 50 taper in that spindle perfectly." Sarah looked at the heavy, brutal-looking cutters, then turned her head to look at the hulking, dripping mass of the Carnian Trekker sitting in the center of the concrete floor. Even with the ways wiped clean, it still looked like a rusted monument to a bygone era. "If it works," she said softly. The sharp, analytical edge of the math teacher suddenly dropped away, revealing the quiet exhaustion of a wife who just wanted her husband to catch a break. "What does it actually do, Elias? What does it give you that you don't already have with your welding gear?" Elias walked over to the milling machine. He placed a clean, scarred hand on the bare silver metal of the column. "It hogs," he said simply. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "It hogs?" In this trade, taking a light, fast pass over a piece of metal is called skimming, Elias explained, his voice taking on a quiet, absolute intensity. But when you need to remove a massive amount of incredibly hard material, when you need to dig deep into an alloy that would shatter Vance Gilleran's delicate little aluminum cutting machines, you don't skim, you hog it out. This machine is built to take cuts a quarter-inch deep in solid, heat-treated tool steel, and it does it without vibrating. It just drops its shoulder and powers through the metal like a plow through dirt. He turned back to look at his wife. There are heavy repair contracts in this county. Farm implement axles, mining equipment, logging grapples. Nobody local bids on them because the material is too stubborn for modern CNCs. They ship those jobs 2 states over. If this machine runs, I can take every single one of those contracts. Sarah held his gaze for a long, silent moment. She understood risk, and she understood variables. Right now, this towering iron beast was a massive, unproven variable sitting right in the middle of their fragile livelihood. She reached out and pushed the lid of the laptop down. It closed with a soft, final click. "All right," Sarah said, stepping away from the bench. "Here's the equation, Elias. If it cuts, you keep it. If it doesn't, we haul it to the scrapyard by Christmas to cover the electrical bill." The Blue Ridge Diner sat right on the edge of the county line, a cinder block box with a flickering neon coffee cup in the window. It served as the unofficial morning boardroom for every contractor, rigger, and heavy equipment operator in Oconee County. On a Friday morning in late November, the air inside was thick with the smell of scorched bacon grease, wet wool, and cheap, scalding drip coffee. Elias Thorne sat at the far end of the Formica counter, nursing a heavy ceramic mug. His back was radiating a dull, familiar heat down his left leg, the result of spending the past 2 weeks crawling around the concrete floor of his barn, mapping out the electrical lines for the phase converter. His knuckles were still faintly stained with the dark ghost of 60-year-old grease that pumice silk just couldn't lift. He was staring into the black surface of his coffee, enjoying the rare, quiet warmth, when the door chimed loudly. Small towns don't have secrets. They have audiences. When a man takes a financial risk in a place like Seneca, he doesn't do it in a vacuum. He does it on a brightly lit stage, usually between 6 and 7 in the morning, in front of men who gauge their success by how easily they can pay their truck notes. 3 stools down the counter sat Vance Gillerin. Vance was flanked by 3 local grading contractors, holding court in a spotless navy blue fleece vest with the Precision Tech logo embroidered sharply over his heart. He was gesturing with half a piece of toast, explaining some new production metric, when he caught sight of Elias out of the corner of his eye. A slow, predatory grin spread across Vance's face. He didn't lower his voice. In fact, he dialed it up, projecting his words so they carry perfectly over the clatter of silverware and the hiss of the flat-top grill. "Well, if it isn't Elias," Vance called out. Elias didn't turn his head. He just took a slow breath and tightened his grip on his mug. "My driver was out delivering a load of aluminum brackets near your place yesterday," Vance continued, leaning forward so he could look past the contractors. "Said he saw that World War II relic sitting right in the middle of your barn. You starting a museum out there on County Road 9, Elias? Gonna charge admission?" The 3 contractors sitting next to Vance chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of men who recognized the hierarchy of the room and knew which side of the joke to be on. Elias finally turned his head. He looked at Vance, taking in the clean hands, the expensive fleece, the absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who believed software had conquered the physical world. "Fixing it up," Elias said. His voice was quiet, a low gravel that didn't strain to compete with the diner's ambient noise. Vance shook his head, looking down at his plate with a theatrical sigh before turning back to Elias. His tone shifted from mocking to a patronizing sort of pity. "Let me give you some free business advice, Elias. Seriously, because I hate seeing a guy throw good money after bad. You cannot run a business on nostalgia." Vance tapped his index finger against the counter to emphasize his point. My Haas machines hold tolerances that your grandpa couldn't even dream of, and they do it while I'm sleeping. My shop floor is running lights out right now. That Kearney and Trekker? It was built to make tank parts. The world doesn't need tank parts anymore, buddy. You bought a 9,000-pound paperweight. The diner had gone completely silent. The waitress paused with a coffee pot in her hand. The men in the booths had stopped chewing. They were all waiting to see if Elias Thorne, a man who had spent a decade breaking his back in a rail yard, was going to slide off his stool and teach the arrogant CNC shop owner a lesson in physical mass. But Elias didn't flare up. He didn't defend the sheer, uncompromising geometry of cast iron boxways, or explain the physics of vibration dampening, or mention the massive shell mills sitting in his red toolbox. You can't explain the ocean to a man who has only ever sailed in a swimming pool. Elias brought the ceramic mug to his lips, took one final, slow sip of the bitter coffee, and set it down. He reached into the pocket of his faded Carhartt jacket, pulled out a worn $5 bill, and smoothed it flat on the Formica counter. He looked Vance Gillerin dead in the eye. "We'll see," Elias said. He turned, favoring his left leg just a fraction, pushed open the heavy glass door, and walked out into the cold November morning, leaving the diner and its audience entirely behind him. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to unfreeze a piece of machinery that has sat motionless since the Reagan administration? It is not a matter of simply replacing a belt or turning a key. You cannot force it. If you apply blind, ignorant leverage to a bound gear, the teeth will shear off, and the machine will be permanently destroyed. No, waking up dormant cast iron is not mechanics. It is a matter of metallurgical diplomacy. The first hard stretch of the resurrection lasted 6 long, freezing weeks. December had crept into upstate South Carolina, dropping the temperature inside the uninsulated pole barn to a bitter, damp 40 degrees. Elias's breath plumed in the air as he unbolted the massive side inspection plate of the Kearney and Trekker's main column, breaking a gasket seal that hadn't seen daylight since the Eisenhower administration. Inside the column sat a complex, massive geared transmission that controlled the machine's speeds and feeds. It was supposed to be bathed in 12 gallons of slick amber hydraulic oil. Instead, time and temperature had chemically altered the fluid. What oozed out of the drain plug was a thick, putrid sludge with the exact consistency of black molasses. It took 3 days just for the sump to drip empty into a series of 5-gallon plastic buckets. Once it was drained, Elias had to pump pure kerosene into the gearbox. He spent a week standing on a milk crate, leaning deep into the cast iron cavern with his bare hands, using stiff nylon brushes to manually scrub the hardened tar out of the massive helical gears. He was up to his elbows in freezing, toxic sludge, the sharp chemical reek of kerosene burning his nostrils. But the transmission was just the preamble. The true nightmare was the main spindle. The spindle is the heart of a milling machine. It is the heavy steel shaft that holds the cutting tool and rotates with devastating force. And Elias's spindle was seized entirely solid. It was molecularly bonded to its bearings by 3 decades of dried cosmoline and microscopic rust. For 8 days, Elias tried patience. Every 4 hours, he sprayed specialized penetrating oil directly into the bearing seams. He would wake up at 2 in the morning, pull a jacket over his pajamas, limp out to the freezing barn in the pitch dark, apply the oil, and go back to bed. It didn't work. The spindle refused to give a single millimeter. Patience had failed. It was time for violence. Elias dug through his scrap bin and pulled out a block of 4140 chromoly steel an incredibly tough, medium carbon alloy. Working on his small manual lathe, he spent a full day machining a custom, heavy-duty spanner wrench designed to perfectly grip the nose of the stubborn spindle. Once the wrench was locked in place, he slipped a 6-foot-long steel cheater pipe over the handle to multiply his leverage. Even then, cold force wouldn't be enough. He needed thermal expansion. He dragged his heavy oxyacetylene torch over to the machine. Igniting the tip with a flint striker, he adjusted the valves until a jagged, roaring blue flame hissed in the cold air. Carefully, methodically, Elias began to heat the massive cast-iron housing surrounding the spindle. He didn't want to melt it. He just needed to expand the outer casting fractions of 1/1000th of an inch, pulling it away from the trapped spindle inside. He worked the torch for 20 minutes, watching the iron sweat out old oil, the air filling with the acrid, choking smoke of burning sulfur and ancient cutting fluid. When his infrared thermometer read 400 degrees on the housing, he shut the torch off. He stepped back, grabbed the end of the 6-foot cheater pipe, and threw his entire body weight into it. His boots slipped on the concrete. The L4 vertebra in his lower back screamed, a blinding spike of electric pain shooting down his left leg. He gritted his teeth, closed his eyes, and applied 800 foot-pounds of pure, desperate torque. He was pushing so hard his vision began to narrow into a dark, pulsing tunnel. "You can't run a business on nostalgia," Vance Gilleran's voice echoed in his memory, uninvited and infuriating. "It's a 9,000-pound paperweight." Elias dug his heels in and shoved. Crack! The sound was deafening. It sounded exactly like a .30-06 rifle firing inside a concrete bunker. The sharp, concussive boom echoed violently off the tin roof of the pole barn. Elias stumbled forward as the cheater pipe suddenly gave way. He caught himself against the edge of the heavy iron work table, gasping for air, clutching his lower back. Silence rushed back into the barn. Panic gripped his chest. A crack that loud meant one of two things. Either the spindle had finally broken free from its chemical prison, or Elias had just snapped the main drive shaft in half, turning his entire investment into literal, unfixable junk. Heart pounding, smelling of sweat, sulfur, and kerosene, he limped back to the front of the machine. He reached out with a trembling, scarred hand, gripped the warm nose of the spindle, and gave it a gentle twist. It turned, smoothly, quietly, gliding on its precision bearings like it had just rolled off the assembly line in Milwaukee 67 years ago. The machine was alive. By the second week of January, the brutal cold of upstate South Carolina had finally breached the thin metal walls of the pole barn, turning the concrete floor into a block of solid ice. But Elias Thorne wasn't paying attention to the temperature. He was staring at a heavy gray electrical box mounted to the wall, his hand resting on a thick black conduit that snaked across the floor to the base of the Kearney Trekker. The proof was about to arrive. For days, he had painstakingly wired the heavy, spinning mass of the rotary phase converter, double-checking the voltage drops across the capacitors. He had filled the massive column of the milling machine with 12 gallons of fresh, translucent amber ISO 68 circulating oil, watching it coat the pristine helical gears he had spent weeks scrubbing by hand. Now, there was nothing left to clean. There was nothing left to repair. The math that Sarah had laid out on her spreadsheet hung squarely on what happened in the next 60 seconds. Elias reached out and flipped the heavy disconnect switch on the wall. In the corner of the barn, the rotary phase converter spun to life with a high, building whine, generating the artificial third leg of power. Elias stepped up to the control panel of the milling machine. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the black start button. The 15-horsepower primary drive motor didn't scream or shriek like the high-speed spindles at Precision Tech. Instead, it awoke with a concussive, deep-chested roar. It was a low, seismic hum, a rolling wave of raw mechanical authority that transferred straight through the iron vase, into the concrete slab, and directly into the soles of Elias's work boots. The machine was breathing. He walked over to his heavy workbench and picked up a 6-inch block of raw O1 tool steel. Let me be clear about O1. This is not the mild, agreeable structural steel they use to frame buildings, and it certainly isn't the soft aerospace aluminum Vance Gillerin loved to cut. O1 is a notoriously angry, carbon-rich alloy. It is abrasive, it is stubborn, and it actively fights back against whatever is trying to shape it. Elias hauled the heavy block over to the milling machine and locked it down onto the massive cast-iron table, clamping it fiercely into place with heavy T-nuts and hardened steel studs. Then, he reached into his red toolbox and retrieved one of his grandfather's ancient, brutal cutting tools. A 4-inch diameter shell mill, studded with thick, brazed carbide teeth. He hoisted it up and locked it into the spindle's massive number 50 taper with a heavy wrench. If you were to take this exact setup, this block of O1 and this 4-inch cutter, and program a modern, lightweight CNC machine to take a deep, aggressive pass, the results would be violently predictable. The machine would flex. The tool would chatter so violently it would rattle the fillings out of your teeth, and within 3 seconds, the carbide inserts would detonate into a shower of expensive shrapnel. Elias grabbed the heavy hand wheel that controlled the knee's elevation. He watched the graduated dial closely, feeling the smooth, fluid resistance of the freshly oiled boxways. He dialed the knee up until the carbide teeth touched the surface of the steel. Then, he set the depth of cut. He didn't dial in 10 thousandths of an inch. He didn't dial in 50 thousandths. He cranked the heavy wheel until the dial read 0.250. A full 1/4 inch of solid, unforgiving tool steel. He locked the knee firmly in place. He reached out, his scarred knuckles brushing the cold iron, and engaged the mechanical power feed. Deep inside the column, a clutch engaged with a solid, metallic thud. The massive table began to advance slowly, steadily feeding the block of O1 directly into the spinning teeth of the 4-inch cutter. Elias held his breath, his eyes fixed on the point of impact. The carbide hit the steel. There was no scream. There was no hesitation. The massive 9,000-pound cast-iron frame of the Carnian Trekker simply absorbed the violent kinetic energy of the impact and completely erased the vibration. The spindle did not slow down by a single fraction of a revolution. On the wall behind the machine, the needle on the analog ammeter barely twitched. The machine just dropped its shoulder and tore through the metal. Thick, heavy chips of O1 steel curled off the face of the cutter. They were so hot they had instantly turned a dark, oxidized blue. They flew through the cold January air and rained down onto the concrete floor, clinking and pinging with a sound exactly like handfuls of broken glass being swept onto a sidewalk. Elias stood motionless, mesmerized by the hypnotic, rhythmic crunch of the cutter obliterating the steel. It was effortless. It was absolute, undeniable mechanical supremacy. When the cutter cleared the back edge of the block, Elias disengaged the feed and hit the stop button. The machine spun down, the roaring hum fading back into the quiet hiss of the winter wind against the barn roof. He grabbed a blue shop towel and wiped away the faint film of dark cutting oil from the newly machined surface. He didn't need the dial indicator to tell him what he had just done, but he mounted the magnetic base anyway. He dragged the ruby-tipped stylus across the 6-inch span of the cut. The surface of the O1 steel wasn't just flat. It was a flawless, gleaming mirror. The needle on the Mitutoyo gauge fluttered, registering a deviation of exactly 0.0001 inches. One single 10,000th of an inch. Elias Thorne stood in the freezing barn, smelling the sharp, metallic tang of hot steel, and let out a long, ragged exhale. The paperweight could sing. Spring usually came to the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains with a soft, forgiving warmth. But in March of 2022, a distinctly cold panic settled over the gleaming epoxy floors of Precision Tech. For years, Vance Gilleran's shop had hummed with the predictable, soothing rhythm of aluminum chips raining against sheet metal. But on a Tuesday afternoon, that hum had been replaced by a chaotic, terrifying screech that sounded like a car crash being played on a continuous loop. The crisis began down in Greenville. Apex Aerospace, a massive Tier 2 defense supplier, had landed a lucrative government contract requiring specialized engine mounts. 400 of them to be exact. The contract for the initial roughing phase, carving the raw metal blocks down to their approximate final shape before finished machining, was shopped around. Vance, looking at a $52,000 payout and trusting blindly in the speed of his modern Haas vertical machining centers, had aggressively underbid the competition and won the job. The problem lay entirely in the material specified on the blueprint. The mounts had to be cut from solid blocks of Inconel 718. If you have never worked in aerospace manufacturing, let me explain exactly what Inconel 718 is. It is not steel. It is a highly engineered nickel-chromium superalloy. It was birthed in a laboratory specifically to sit inside the screaming heart of a jet turbine and retain its structural integrity at a blistering 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. It is incredibly abrasive. Worse, it possesses a vicious metallurgical trait called work hardening. If your cutting tool rubs against it, instead of slicing cleanly and deeply through, the surface of the Inconel instantly hardens into a diamond-like armor that will completely destroy whatever touches it next. You cannot cut it with speed. You must cut it with overwhelming, unyielding physical pressure. By day 4 of the Apex contract, Vance's pristine, climate-controlled shop was an absolute disaster zone. The lightweight fabricated steel frames of his modern machines simply lacked the physical mass required to push a cutter steadily through the superalloy. Every time a spindle drove down into the Inconel, the machine flexed. That microscopic flex created bounce, and that bounce created catastrophic vibration. Vance stood helplessly in front of machine number 3, his face pale, watching through the Lexan window. The machine shrieked, the frame shuddering so violently that the synthetic coolant splashed over the sides of the containment pan. Suddenly, a sickening crack echoed through the shop. Vance slammed his fist into the emergency stop button. He pulled open the sliding doors, choking on the acrid smoke of burning oil. Inside, a solid carbide end mill, a highly engineered cutting tool that cost $180, was sheared cleanly in half. Its jagged fragments were permanently embedded in the ruined block of Inconel. It was the 22nd tool he had broken since Monday. He had vaporized $4,000 in consumable tooling in just under 96 hours. Sitting on the inspection table behind him were exactly 6 usable parts. He needed 400. The killing blow landed on Thursday morning. Vance was sitting in his glass-walled office, rubbing his temples, when the phone rang. It was the procurement manager from Apex Aerospace. They weren't calling to check in. They were calling to lay down the law. The delivery deadline was exactly 8 days away. Apex's assembly lines were hungry, and the manager's voice through the speakerphone was devoid of any sympathy. If Vance failed to deliver the 400 roughed blanks by next Friday, he wouldn't just lose the $52,000. He would trigger a $25,000 failure to deliver penalty clause that he had arrogantly skimmed over when signing the contract. Worse, the manager made it clear that Apex would immediately blacklist Precision Tech and pull every existing aerospace contract out of Oconee County. effectively gutting Vance's revenue stream for the next 3 years. Vance hung up the phone, the blood draining from his face. The sleek, modern empire he had built entirely on speed and software was suddenly crumbling against the immovable reality of physical mass, and for the first time in his professional life, he had absolutely no idea how to fix it. Reckonings almost never happen on a brightly lit stage. When a man whose entire identity is built on absolute certainty is finally forced to admit he has failed, there are no crowds, no diner audiences, no theatrical apologies. It happens quietly, in the fading light of a Friday evening, at the end of a long gravel driveway, when he has simply run out of options. At 6:30, the heavy crunch of tires rolling over the frost-heaved gravel of County Road 9 cut through the quiet of Elias Thorne's property. Elias was standing at his workbench, running a flat file over a piece of scrap steel, when the headlights of a late-model Ford F-250 swept across the corrugated metal walls of the pole barn. The truck shifted into park, the engine cut off, and the driver's door opened with a heavy, metallic slam. Vance Gillerin stepped out into the chill of the March evening. He did not look like the man who owned the largest, most profitable modern machine shop in Oconee County. The crisp, patronizing aura he had worn at the Blue Ridge Diner was entirely gone. His signature navy blue fleece vest was zipped up crookedly. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and his shoulders carried the distinct, heavy slump of a man who had not slept in 3 days. He looked hollowed out. He walked slowly toward the open bay doors of the pole barn, his expensive leather boots dragging slightly in the dirt. Elias didn't stop filing. He didn't turn around. He just waited. Vance stepped over the threshold and stopped. His eyes immediately bypassed Elias and locked onto the center of the concrete floor. The 1954 Carney and Trecker horizontal milling machine sat there, under the halo of the overhead lights. It no longer looked like a shipwreck. The 67 years of sludge and cosmoline were gone, revealing the massive, muscular geometry of the bare cast iron. The exposed ways gleamed with fresh oil. The rotary phase converter in the corner was buzzing steadily, and the machine itself was idling, the 15-horsepower motor producing a low, seismic, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. It looked like an armored dreadnought sitting quietly at anchor. Vance stared at the massive, indestructible column. He looked at the heavy steel handles, the rigid knee, the sheer, undeniable density of 9,450 pounds of American iron. "I'm breaking tools," Vance said. The words were quiet, barely audible over the hum of the motor. The admission cost him visible, physical effort. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and looked away from the machine to Elias. Elias set his file down on the bench. He reached for a clean blue shop towel and began wiping the dark dust from his scarred hands, turning slowly to face the younger man. He didn't smile. He didn't cross his arms. He didn't offer a single syllable of triumph. He just waited for Vance to finish bleeding his pride out onto the concrete. "The Inconel is work-hardening the second my cutters touch it," Vance continued, his voice thin, stripped of all its usual corporate polish. "My frames are flexing. They don't have the mass to push through the chatter. Every time the spindle drops, the vibration shatters the carbide. I can't skim it. I need hogging power." Vance paused, his eyes darting back to the looming silhouette of the Carney. "I need pure, brute force rigidity." Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute, save for the deep, breathing hum of the machine. "I'm 8 days out from the deadline, Elias," Vance said, the desperation finally bleeding through. "If I don't deliver, Apex pulls every contract in the county. I'll subcontract the roughing passes directly to you. 400 blanks. I'll pay you $12,000, but they have to be done by Wednesday, or we both lose." Elias tossed the blue shop towel onto the workbench. He walked slowly over to the milling machine, favoring his left leg just a fraction, the persistent ache in his crushed L4 vertebra acting as a grounding rod. He rested a hand on the cold, solid iron of the overarm support. He thought about the men in the diner. He thought about the spreadsheet his wife had built and the $135 they had left over. He looked back at Vance, his pale blue eyes flat and unreadable. 15,000, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left absolutely no room for debate. "And I want the tooling paid for up front, tomorrow morning." Vance stared at him. He knew he was being backed into a corner, completely leveraged by a man he had openly mocked just a few months prior. But he also knew he had absolutely no other choice. Vance swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Deal. The pallets of raw Inconel 718 arrived at dawn on Saturday, dropped unceremoniously onto the concrete by a forklift Vance had rented. For the next 4 days, Elias Thorne's pole barn ceased to be a quiet repair shop and transformed into a theater of industrial siege. Making one perfect cut is a matter of setup and careful mathematics. Making 400 perfect cuts in an aerospace superalloy is a grueling study in the uncompromising physics of mass. Elias loaded the first heavy rectangular blank into the massive, hardened steel jaws of his milling vise, torquing the handle down until his shoulders popped. He didn't use modern, brittle carbide inserts for this run. Reaching deep into his grandfather's heavy tooling, he set a monstrous, solid, high-speed steel cutter into the spindle, the kind of tooling engineered to take a brutal physical beating without instantly shattering. Back at Precision Tech, Vance's modern high-tech machines had vibrated themselves into a fatal resonance, trying to take a fragile 50,000ths of an inch skimming pass. Elias didn't skim. He cranked the heavy iron knee upward, dialed in an aggressive 0.350-inch depth of cut, and threw the mechanical feed lever. The Kearney and Trekker didn't even shudder. When the heavy cutter bit into the Inconel, it didn't scream or shriek. Its sheer physical weight, 4.5 tons of American cast iron anchored directly to the earth, absorbed the harmonic vibration completely. It pulled the destructive kinetic energy away from the tool and buried it deep in the rigid column. The cutter sheared through the nickel-chromium alloy with a steady, relentless, rhythmic crunch. Thick, violently hot chips curled off the block, smoking in the cold air before raining onto the concrete. But the machine's immortality did not extend to the man running it. Elias worked 16-hour shifts, locking himself into a punishing loop of loading, clamping, cutting, and unloading. By Sunday night, his crushed L4 vertebra was radiating a blinding, white-hot ache down both of his legs. He survived on black coffee, cold sandwiches Sarah brought out to the workbench, and sheer, stubborn momentum. The barn filled with a sprawling mountain of razor-sharp silver chips and the permanent metallic stench of vaporized oil. By 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, the massive spindle finally spun to a halt. The quiet that descended on the barn was almost deafening. Sitting on wooden pallets, neatly stacked and dripping with dark coolant, were 400 perfectly roughed engine mounts. An hour later, Vance Gilleran's truck pulled back into the driveway, followed closely by a sterile white fleet vehicle bearing the Apex Aerospace logo. The man who stepped out of the fleet car was the Apex Quality Control Inspector. He wore a pressed polo shirt, clean khakis, and the skeptical, rigid expression of a man who spent his life in brightly lit, climate-controlled laboratories. He took one look at the drafty pole barn, the mountains of metal shavings, and Elias leaning exhausted against a workbench, and his brow furrowed in deep suspicion. The inspector walked over to the pallets with a clipboard and a velvet-lined case. He pulled out a set of digital calipers and a specialized surface gauge. He picked up the first heavy block of Inconel. He ran his thumb across the freshly machined face, testing the geometry. He frowned deeper. He picked up a second block, then a third, then a fourth and fifth, checking the dimensions against his blueprint and scanning the metal under the harsh glare of a flashlight. Slowly, the inspector lowered his tools. He looked around the dusty, grease-stained barn, entirely disoriented. He turned to Vance, who was standing quietly near the open bay doors. "Vance," the inspector said, his voice laced with absolute, genuine confusion. "How did you get a surface finish this clean on a roughing pass? This is Inconel. There's 0 chatter marks. I've got Tier 1 suppliers with $1 million horizontals who can't get it this smooth." Vance Gillerin didn't puff out his chest. He didn't try to spin a corporate narrative about proprietary programming, and he didn't try to claim the victory for precision tech. The exhaustion and the humility of the last week had burned all the pretense out of him. He looked at the towering, brutal silhouette of the 1954 Carney and Trekker. Then he looked at Elias Thorne, who was quietly wiping the grit off his hands with a blue paper towel. "I didn't," Vance said quietly. "He did." Let me tell you where things stand today, because the world has a funny way of eventually remembering what it used to know, long after the software patches have expired and the flashing neon signs have burned out. Thorne Heavy Machining occupies that quiet pocket of Oconee County where the map stops pretending to care about subdivisions. Last year, the books closed with a gross revenue of $312,000. Elias doesn't cut medical plastics, and he doesn't chase the sleek, fast-paced aluminum volumes that keep the younger crowd awake at night. He takes the work that makes other shops sweat, the deep-pocket titanium, the stubborn Inconel, the massive, angry forgings that demand a machine with an actual spine. He holds direct contracts with Apex Aerospace now, a steady stream of heavy structural components that arrive on flatbeds and leave on schedule. The pole barn has evolved too. If you stepped inside today, you wouldn't just see the lone survivor from the Seneca tax auction. 2 more vintage heavyweights stand alongside the original Carney and Trekker, a massive Cincinnati vertical and a horizontal rig rescued from an abandoned textile plant across the Georgia line, both saved from the scrap torch just in time. Elias still works with his hands black with oil, still favors his left leg when the damp weather rolls down from the mountains, and still listens to the rhythm of the shop floor like a physician checking a pulse. Vance Gillerin still runs Precision Tech, and his business is as profitable as ever. But the tone in the Blue Ridge Diner changed permanently after that March in 2022. Vance doesn't make jokes about boat anchors anymore. In fact, when a particularly nasty, high-stress alloy contract lands on his sleek glass desk, a job that would shatter his clean white machines, he doesn't panic. He simply packs the raw block into a heavy wooden crate, loads it into the bed of his F250, and drives it down to County Road 9. And out in the barn, the 1954 Carney and Trekker Model 3K keeps right on turning. It is 72 years old now. It has no USB ports, no digital touchscreens, and it will never prompt you to download a software update. It cannot think for itself, and it doesn't pretend to be smart. It requires a human being, someone with scarred knuckles, a worn-out pair of work boots, and an ear trained to catch the exact pitch where friction turns into harmony. It was built in a Milwaukee foundry during an era when men believed that if you poured enough iron into a frame and ground the ways true enough, The tool would comfortably outlast the generation that created it. They were right.